I think there's probably something about this perceived notion of the finality of the choice, or that sort of, like this really strong, not boundary, but wall that you're kind of like laying down that makes it hard to make this decision. And you were saying earlier that, yeah, we're like our value is being placed as being a woman, or, whether we have children or we don't have children. There is this changing narrative that is allowing for this flexibility, and you have a choice. And sometimes having a choice is actually more confusing than not having any choice at all.
I'm Keltie Maguire, and you're listening to the Kids Are Childfree podcast. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Kids Are Childfree podcast. Today's guest is someone who I've known for quite a long time now. I've gotten to know her in a few different contexts, and I also don't know her super well. But I have to say, what I do know of her makes me think she would be a fantastic guest. Now, you'll hear a little bit more about how I know this person in just a second. But first, I'd love to introduce you to Natasha. With over 20 years of experience in the field of psychology, Dr. Natasha Ghosh is an expert in helping people feel more emotionally grounded, peaceful, purposeful, and in charge of their life. Natasha's practice is rooted in science and soul, integrating both evidence-based therapies, strong intuition, and specialized techniques that lead to deep healing and transformation. All right, Natasha, you and I go, on the one hand, way back several years, because for those who don't know, I actually was a jewelry designer before I was a coach, and Natasha was a wonderful customer of mine, and we got to know each other that way, and then as fellow business owners. And so it's interesting because we've known each other a while, and I guess predominantly in sort of like a professional capacity. But I'm excited to talk to you today because I know next to nothing about your journey into motherhood. You're going to talk about, I don't even know how many kids you have. This is like, it's all cliffhanger, although you made a reference to the fact that maybe you have two. And I didn't say it to you earlier, but when you mentioned that your daughter just graduated, I sort of had in my mind that you maybe had a daughter that was about 10. Mm-hmm. So I can only imagine that life has gone as quickly for you as it has for me on the outside watching you. All my preamble aside, thank you so much for coming to the show. And of course, by the way, I would love to hear about your journey into deciding to have kids. However, I also invited you on because you've been doing some really interesting things with your both counseling, therapy work, as well as the coaching you do. And specifically, I've seen you sharing workshops and events with different kinds of modalities that I think could be helpful for this decision. So my prologue aside, why don't you just tell us a little bit about who you are, Natasha, and welcome to the show.
Well, Keltie, thank you so much for having me. It has been a long time that we've known each other, but haven't really known each other all at the same time. So it's really nice to be here having this discussion with you. Yeah, I've seen your business change, grow, and evolve, and I think that's really beautiful. Where would you like me to start? With my personal or professional side of things?
Why don't you give us like the sort of top level professional stuff, but also a little bit about just who you are as a person. And then we'll get into the kids question.
Sure. Sounds good. So, my name is Natasha. I feel like I'm going to I like long walks on the beach, but,
me too. Which beach?
Well, we moved about 3 years ago. So we used to live downtown. We would walk along English Bay, and now we're, Ambleside is the one that we tend to go to the most. So it's very beautiful nice. Down there. I have two kids. I have two daughters. One is 18 and the other one is 13. The 18-year-old graduated yesterday. So that was kind of an interesting experience to look back at how, we always say the days are long, but the years are fast. So that's been something. Yeah. But while I also have a husband, and we've raised our family. And then through that, I've also done lots of things professionally. So I teach up at a private college on the university campus here. I also have a private therapy practice. I'm continually learning new things, as you saw. Like, I'm always learning new modalities, new ways of working with people, and also like new ways of understanding myself and how I want to be in the world.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that, because that's something that came through to me, checking your website before today's conversation. And I think that's probably the case for all of us who do this kinds of work supporting other people in their transformations or growth journeys, et cetera. And it might be something that it's easy for let's call it outsiders or our clients or our customers, what have you, to lose sight of is that we're also going through and doing this work.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's something that very much informs where we focus and how we support people, and we learn and grow beside the people we support. So I'm excited to hear a little bit more about your journey in a few minutes, but tell me first of all, so you're a mother to two kids, 13 and 18, both daughters, you said?
Yes.
Okay. And so I don't want to say how did this happen? We don't need to get into all the nitty gritty,
Okay.
but first of all, had you always known that you wanted to have kids?
Yes and no. I think that there was like this part of me that had this understanding of what life is supposed to look like. And then there was this other part of me that said, well, it could also look different, and that you have choice here around what you want to do and what you don't want to do. So the idea of me with a family and with kids was something that was kind of like, okay, I can roll into this. And there was also a part of me was like, no, this is not for me, that I want to be someone or something different in this world.
Super interesting. And so how did you navigate that tension, and like over what period of time did that sort of evolve and change and eventually lead you to the decision to have kids?
So the first child, it was kind of funny actually, because there was this point where I was saying to Richard, who's my partner, listen, we gotta either have a baby or get a dog, one way or the other. It's one of those two things. And I think we were ready, and people talk about that biological clock and that push.
Mm.
And I really felt that with my first one. There was this urgency to have a baby. And I don't know how much of that was biological and how much of it was sort of this psychological push because it was the right time to have one. But I'd like to think that there was more of this push that I couldn't understand from a psychological perspective, because I'm fairly thoughtful and I like to use my mind and I think about a lot of things, which both can, serve me well, but get me into a lot of trouble. And I couldn't think this piece of my life. It just felt like I really wanted to do this. And so we had always planned we were thinking about having our first child. Her name is Leela, like in a year. And so we say she's planned, but she came early. And then the second one was a little bit more of a desire, like a thoughtful mind sort of piece, which was, I'm an only child. I really wanted my first one to have a sibling, knowing that sometimes it doesn't work out that way, right? It's not always that siblings are going to love and care for each other when they're older, but my experience with other people and their siblings have always been so amazing, and it's something that I wanted. So I thought, like when I'm dead, it would be nice for them to have each other. And the second one, though, was really, we weren't sure because we'd had this first one. She was very sweet, very easy. Our life was nice. And, as parents, it was like a 2-on-1 situation. So there was always room to be child free, as it were, if you needed some time. And so the second one, we actually made like a bit of a deadline because I didn't want to be pregnant during the summer. I had a pretty hard pregnancy. And so we said, okay, if I'm not pregnant by this date, we would not be having a second child. And
Wow.
well, and the thing was, we would try and then we'd stop. We'd try and then we'd stop. And so finally we were like, okay, if we're going to do it, we're going to do it. I was really sick and my husband was on antibiotics or something. And it was like, all right, get yourself started, sweetheart. And then let's get going. Like there was this aspect of let's just do it. So that was kind of those decisions that you make about just doing something and moving forward versus, oh my gosh, there's this desire. Obviously, we wanted the second one too. There was a desire there, but it was a very different kind of desire.
Yeah. Super interesting. And I mean, great insight to recognize how it was different. Not just having a second child, because of course that's a different sort of dynamic, but how that decision was approached differently and how it felt differently. I'm curious, how old were you when you had your first daughter?
30.
30. Okay. And did that feel like for you? I mean, it's interesting because for many people, there's a sense of like, am I ready? Is it the right timing? aside from this sort of like biological or maybe more like emotional desire sort of drive that you felt, were there other factors that made you say this is the right timing? And do you subscribe to the notion that you're ever ready, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's such a good question because I was thinking a lot about this. And I think this also just like relates to how I think about a lot of things in life, which is if you, oh, I was going to say, if you make a decision, you can always make another one, but you kind of can't on this one. And I think that's part of the problem, right? Like once you decide if you're going to have one, then the joke was always, my mother said to me, you know, she doesn't come with a receipt, right? Because I was like, I would go and I would buy things and I would try them on at home and then I'd return them. That was like the joke in our family. And she was like, it does, you know, this baby doesn't come with a receipt. So there is sort of this finality in a sense to this choice. But the choice of, or the idea that you can have 100% clarity on every choice that you make on big choices, I don't think is actually true. And I think that there is this part of us that wants that, to know we made the right decision. But I think that there there needs to be space for whatever decision I can make a good life for myself.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. And I think that there is such a pervasive narrative. And listen, I understand where it comes from, but this idea of 100% certainty, of being all in, of really, really wanting it. And, you know, I fully understand, especially if people have had the experience of feeling like their parents weren't all in or they weren't fully wanted, that there's a desire to say, like, you know, kids we bring into this world, the parents should be all in for that. And it's a massive commitment. You should be 100% in for that. But I also think this can really scare people, because I think if you're sort of a, you know, self-aware, thoughtful, kind of pragmatic person, like I can think of very few things in my life where I've ever felt like 100% unwavering certainty. And if I did, it's usually certainty that came over time through making, you know, the commitment, through showing up. I can think of, you know, my husband is a great example. It's like the first date, I was curious. I was like, okay, I want to see this guy again. Like, you know, how does this look? How are things evolving between us? And again, like you say, it's hard with a child because the curiosity can only come before the decision. Like we still then have to make a firm decision. But I think it's something you grow into over time, regardless of which path you choose, is that like that confidence develops, the feeling 100%, if that's even a thing, which for me, I don't know if it is. I think for a lot of us, it isn't. But it's not something that you get to 100% and then you decide. It's like you decide and then the confidence grows.
I think so. I think you also decide and then you find the evidence that matches your decision, right? Like we do that all the time for lots of things. We make choices and then we say, oh, thank goodness I made that choice because of XYZ. Or look, this is happening now. If I hadn't made that choice, I wouldn't have this opportunity. But you would be saying that even if you made a different choice, because that's kind of the way that we work. And this piece around 100% clarity, there's a lot of, I see a lot of social media and like coaches that are talking about like the full body yes when they work with somatic work. This idea that unless your whole body says yes, I'm like, girl, the last time my whole body said yes was a long time ago to anything, right? And so, because I think there's this idea that we can hold multiple emotions at one time isn't something that we talk about a lot. It's either yes or no, or this way or that way. But actually, if you look back at a lot of the decisions that you made, you'll see that you made it both with a certain amount of yes and a certain amount of, oh my God, what am I doing right now? Or fear or whatever that is. But it's about continuing to move forward and putting one foot in front of the other.
Yeah. So true. And I'm curious to know, you know, talking about holding mixed emotions or sort of like living in that gray zone, if you will, tell us about becoming a mom and what some of those mixed emotions were for you. I'm curious to know sort of like what parts were the no, which parts were the yes, or like what was that mixed bag of feelings for you?
I think it was very different for the first one and the second one. With the first one, I mean, there was no mixed bag of like, oh, I shouldn't have done this, but there was like this, oh my gosh, this is so amazing and so horrible all at the same time. You know, it wasn't that, Actually, there probably was a time that I said, oh my gosh, what have I done? And I shouldn't have done it if I was like super honest, I suppose. But it is about just figuring it out. So I think there is this, like, you have to lean into the confidence that you have what it takes to just figure it out. And that's,
Yeah.
again, with anything in life. With the second one, with the first one also, the other thing that I think that was really big at the time was you couldn't just have a baby. You were also a mompreneur because you also had all of this time now to do all of these things. And so my own identity as a human being was now not just adjusting to being a mom. And, I'd taken time off of work from teaching. So I wasn't just adjusting to being a new mother who was learning everything for the first time in a, society where we're fairly, even though we say it takes a village, we don't often create those villages. So you're kind
Yeah.
of on your own a little bit. And so there was this sense of like, am I doing enough? Am I being a good enough mom, not just by taking care of my child, but also building a business, was somehow enrolled in that. And then with the second one, I definitely took more time to sleep when she slept, probably watched a bunch of soap operas during the day, like I really allowed myself to have the experience of rest in between. So my kids are about 5 years apart. So they
Mm-hmm.
are essentially in many ways only children, because when my second one's born, the first one went to kindergarten. So I had this huge space of time. And so I allowed myself that time when the older one was at school in order to rest and be able to be there for both of them.
I'm curious what happened in your life, or like what shifted your thinking to do that differently the second time around, and to say, I'm going to allow myself the space and not feel like I have to be and do all the things.
I think what switched is that I just got older. I got
Yeah.
older, a little wiser. You learn from your experiences, I don't want to say from your mistakes, but because I don't think they are mistakes. We learn from our experiences.
Yeah.
And what I really learned was that I didn't need to also have a side business, that I was enough to just be a mother of two moms. And we also had a lot more medical concerns with the second one in the
Mm-hmm.
beginning. And then we also had a little bit of help. And that was also a big deal too, which was, how do I accept help and still be a good mom, right? And not have to do it all, as being like, so not taking on that identity as well. So it was being really
Yeah.
aware of where I was taking on other people's expectations of what I should be doing versus what do I need? What do I want to be able to just like be a good human in the world?
Yeah. It's so interesting you mentioned that, because the next question I actually wanted to ask you is that I saw on your website that you've had quite and this is what we kind of opened up talking about, is
Mm,
how, where we support people and the work that we do in our businesses often reflects what's going on for us personally. And you shared that you've had quite a transformation, sort of from searching for or relying upon maybe some external validation in your life to really cultivating more self-love and showing up more authentically as well. And so, would you be open to sharing a little bit more about this, and maybe how that also has impacted how you have, supported your children, or how parenting has evolved for you?
hmm so I think the transformation for me has been moving away from just talk therapy into
Mm,
connecting with these other parts of me. When we talk about validation, we're socialized that way. This is how we're parented. We are
yeah,
taught to be the good girl or the good boy in those situations. And that's how we learn our boundaries. It's how we learn what's okay and what's not okay. But also, I think we can learn that if the parents are open to parenting differently. And so I think what I realized in my own journey was that in many ways, I was still trying to parent my kids in a way that would be acceptable to my parents. So I still look like a good person to them. And then when I realized actually what I was doing was passing on this family line of anxiety to my first child, and then also realizing that my second child really didn't respond to that kind of parenting, that was one of the other major shifts. So these two things, which was understanding myself better and understanding how I was in relationship to these two humans, really changed how I was in the world.
wow, super interesting. And Again, like incredible to have that awareness of seeing, okay, how you've been carrying on and perpetuating these patterns that you were, I don't want to say victim of. I mean, of course, our parents always do the best that
Yes.
they
Yeah.
can and they know how,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you could see how it was continuing on this sort of legacy of like anxiety. And yeah, really interesting to see how that shift impacted you and your kids, and also how that's been showing up for you in the professional work that you do. So okay, I mean, external validation and sort of doing things the way we've been shown that they should be done is a really big factor in this kids or child-free decision, for a few different reasons. And I think for a lot of my clients, what I see and people listening to this is that it's so hard for us to basically tune out or turn off the sort of external voices that are telling us, especially as women, that our sole purpose in this world is to
Mm-hmm.
become parents, that our own inherent worth is dependent upon having another human or humans.
Yeah.
And it can really, I guess, basically disconnect people from what it is that they want. Because a lot of people I hear say things like, I don't know if I want kids, but I would feel terrible to know that my parents may not become a grandparent. I don't know if I want kids, but all the people around me are having children. And so, how would you encourage or suggest that someone navigates this sort of external validation piece or feeling like you have external pressure to actually connect with what they want?
So I think there's a few things there. The first one is to also be open to hearing other things. So, you said that people are saying that, they're around people with kids, or they're hearing that they should be having a child in order to be validated in this society. But if you listen, there are a lot of people saying something different as well. So what are you choosing to listen to, and what is the story that you are choosing to tell? I think that's the very first thing that I would say, because you can tell whatever story you want. And that's actually quite liberating, that you can tell whatever story you want, and you can listen to different stories to sort of develop your own understanding of what you want. So that's number one, right? Who are you listening to, and what is the story that you are choosing to tell? And so then we move to these ideas of, what you were talking about, like, how do we hear what we are thinking? And I think one of those things is to stop talking about it so much with everybody that you see, because I think that's something we do as humans. We try and information gather. And
Yeah.
in gathering information, which I think is important, I'm not saying we shouldn't information gather, but there comes a point where we're no longer information gathering, and we're actually hoping that we can outsource our decision to somebody else because we don't know what we want to do. And so when we get to that point where we're information gathering and talking about it with people because we're actually outsourcing our decision, that's when we need to start looking inward. And I think that's where things like therapy or breath work or meditation really allows us to start hearing our own voice and creating the story that we want to tell, versus trying to hear everybody else's story in order to make our own, if that makes sense.
100%. And it's such a good observation. And I both identify with that on a personal level, and I see this a lot in my clients. And, I just want to say, I think it's great that we as women have awareness of the messages that we are shown and told, and, that some of the narratives that we are basically sort of like subscribed to, that we have that greater awareness. But I also think it's a fine line between that becoming the story, as you say, that we choose to tell ourselves. Well,
Mm.
everyone's saying I have to do this. They're saying that I must, to be a good woman, I need to be a mother, etc. And I think the more we notice that, we reinforce that, we tell ourselves that, the more we start to
Mm.
actually believe that. And so having a certain degree of awareness, I think, can be good. But to your point, really being cognizant of what are the stories and the messages that I want to like consume or see or hear. And I also see and hear from a lot of my clients that they sort of like basically victimize themselves on the internet by going online and looking at and reading and seeing things that make themselves feel really bad. I
Yes.
know I had somebody who messaged me a couple of days ago, one of my clients, and she's like, "Oh, I saw that another one of my favorite musicians or actors or what have you just had a child over 40, and now I'm feeling kind of down in the dumps again." It's like, I understand some of that stuff is just like in present view, but as best you can, I think we have to be really careful about, especially when we're in this vulnerable kind of middle ground, about what we're looking at, what we're listening
Mm-hmm.
to, what we're seeing. So what you share makes 100% sense. And I do think that it's important, especially when we realize it's become almost compulsive that we're doing that we're
Yes. Yeah.
constantly asking and looking and seeking something out to go within.
I mean, there's a fine line between awareness and rumination, right? Like there's a fine line between like being aware and thinking about it and overthinking as well.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. Okay, if you have been spending the last several months or maybe years making pros and cons lists, trying to figure out whether you want to have kids or stay child free, I'm going to encourage you to stop right there and to do something different instead. And that is to check out one of our upcoming kids or child free online workshops. These are 2-hour online workshops hosted in the company of like-minded women, where I'm going to give you some of the actual tools and resources that I personally use to help make my kids or child-free decision. You're going to walk away from this workshop with a workbook that you can go through on your own time. And I can tell you that these 2 hours together are going to give you so much more clarity and direction in terms of the right choice for you. Find all the details on an upcoming Kids or Child Free workshop over at kidsorchildfree.com or in the show notes of this episode. Okay, so a lot of the women and the folks that I talk with around this decision, they tell me that they feel pretty clear and decisive in most areas of their life. And of course, this is not with everyone. And if you're listening and thinking, well, I'm just generally indecisive, I hear you, I see you. However, a lot of people say, I'm pretty clear about what I want to do professionally. I was clear about my partner. I'm clear about what I want to have for dinner, what have you. But they feel like when it comes to this decision of whether to have kids or stay child free, it's like the answer just seems to evade them, and they can't really understand that. So I'm curious why you think it might be that this particular decision seems to not necessarily like bring up or elicit confidence or clarity like some other choices.
So I'd like to ask a question before I answer the question, which is, what are the kinds of things that your clients or these women are telling you that is clouding their clarity?
Yeah, I mean, I would say certainly what other people are saying, what other people are doing. Fears are really big. So, in particular, I think the biggest kind of overarching fear that I see on both sides is the fear of regret. And that's really tied to something else I want to talk about a little bit more in the conversation, which is this notion of like being able to trust yourself and that what you feel and what you think you want is true. I really sense that people have this idea that there is a definitively right or wrong answer. And the kind of metaphor that I sort of have in my mind is that it's like you've got the answer behind door A or door B, and it's up to you to find, okay, which door do I choose? And I don't really regard the decision process like that, but it's this idea that the decision is somehow out of reach and they can't access it.
I wonder if there's this finality to this decision that doesn't exist in career choices or partner choices, right? There's a kind of an out in those two parts of your life. But if you decide to have a child, they're with you. And if you decide not to, there comes a point where you may not be able to in a biological way. And so I think there's probably something about this perceived notion of the finality of the choice or that sort of, like this really strong, not boundary, but wall that you're kind of like laying down that makes it hard to make this decision. And also, yes, a career and a partner changes your life, but having a child changes your life in a very different way because you're responsible for them differently than you would be for another adult in the world. So there is this huge change. And I also think that you were saying earlier that, we're like our value is being placed as being a woman or, whether we have children or we don't have children. There is this changing narrative that is allowing for this flexibility and you have a choice. And sometimes having a choice is actually more confusing than not having any choice at all.
Totally. Yeah, so true. You make so many good points. And I think all of those things are true. It's the kind of the heaviness or the weight that this decision carries. It's the fact that it's a choice that historically we haven't been given. So I think there's kind of this tension between like the old sort of models or ways of doing things and what we see now. And yet most of us don't have examples of many women in particular, but people in our lives who have lived an entire long life without kids. So we might say, well, I know someone in their 40s or 50s or 60s without children, but what happens later in life? What's that going to look like? So I think there's a lot of unknowns there. that I'm certainly through these stories and conversations hoping to bring more to light. But there's always going to be a question mark factor. And I think part of it goes back to what you said at the beginning of our conversation is it's cultivating the sort of confidence and assuredness that we can have a good life either way.
Yes.
And it's tough to arrive there, but I think there's like, to me, that's kind of the crux of this. If we can get to that place, I think we can make the decision with more calm and less anxiety because we're not spinning out about all of the what ifs and like essentially, what if I ruin my life by choosing wrong?
Yes. Yeah. It's a big responsibility, right? To make the right choice
Yeah.
that's going to impact the rest of your life. And I think that, I really saw that too. That was one of the things that kind of changed how I thought about a lot of the decisions that I made was recognizing that I was putting so much pressure on my older kid when, this idea, if you don't do well on a grade 8 math test, you're going to be like lying in the ditch when you're 24 because you haven't made it in the world. And I realized, oh my gosh, that's not actually true. That's like the anxiety that's been passed down in my family line talking. That's not actually true. And so once we start being able to look at our lives. And, I really encourage people to do a timeline and say, here are these places where I made major milestone decisions. And I made this choice and look, like it worked out or it didn't work out. And then I made another choice and it became okay. So it's about finding that fundamental sense of well-being, right? That whatever we do, we're going to be able to find a way out. We'll be able to figure something out and we can be okay. And that I think is the basic underlying fear of most things, which is, will I be okay?
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, track record of success up to this point, 100% for everyone listening, right? It doesn't mean that things haven't been hard or challenging, but it's reminding ourselves that we have resilience, that we can navigate difficulties, and also not to see either choice as all good or all bad, because there will be aspects or challenges with both, but it doesn't mean the entire decision was a mistake.
And allowing for those mixed emotions as well. I remember having a client who had tried a very long time for a child and they went through a lot of like IVF medical procedures and they had this baby and they loved this baby. And then, this baby turns like 5 and became quite, sassy and defiant. They were having some challenges with her. And she felt like she couldn't be upset or unhappy or feel challenged by it because they tried so hard to have this baby that it wasn't okay to feel like, oh my gosh, what did we do? Because somehow that would negate that whole experience and that desire. And so I think that whatever choice you make, whether it is to have kids or not to have kids, you might come to a point in your life and go, oh, what if I had made this other decision? Or today I actually feel kind of not so great about that decision, but that's also okay too, because you can come back to that sense of, but I'm going to be okay because I can be.
Yeah. So I'm curious, and I'd love to talk a little bit more about some of these tools outside of talk therapy, which I know is, it's one tool in your tool belt, so to speak. But what are some of the ways that we can connect with ourselves, our own inner knowing, or, cultivate that sense of inner knowing to connect with our bodies? And again, these are things I hear and I see, and I know firsthand, it can be really challenging to do. So what is one or more suggestions and how we can start to do this?
So you really said it, which is connecting with our body, right? So we spend a lot of time in our minds, and you'll see actually kids spend a lot of time in their bodies. You can see it when they're excited or when they're angry. You can even if you couldn't hear what they were saying, you can tell by what's going on in their body. And we have forgotten to listen to those parts of us. We tend to focus on our mind, rational thought. And I think that this is probably one of the challenges in this decision, which is, how do I logic my way into making this choice? And that doesn't always work because you're working with your mind and your body and your emotions as well. I really like things like breath work. I like meditation. It allows us to deactivate the nervous system, that fight or flight system that can often cloud our thinking, because our body, as you're trying to make this choice in your mind, you're actually activating your fight or flight system, this survival system, because it feels like a life or death choice in this moment. And so when we when that happens, we have cortisol and adrenaline running through our body, and we're no longer thinking with our rational mind. We're thinking with that sort of survival part of us. And that's not where we want to be making that decision from. So if we can, through our breath, we're able to deactivate that system and we're kind of slow everything down. We're able to then listen to those inner voices a little more easily. And I think that's part of what I see a lot when people are making really big decisions in their life. It's almost like everything speeds up really fast because they're thinking about, they have to do this and they have to do that and they have to make this choice and they have to say yes, they have to say no. Time is running out and time urgency gets really, really intense. So it's almost like we want to slow down time. And we can do that by slowing our body down. Because the last time anyone told me to calm down or think more rationally, it didn't really work very well. So, but we can actually get
me neither.
Right? But you can get to that state by doing it through the body. And so a lot of the work that I do is this body-mind connection where we can start with the body in order to make it easier for the mind to come in and have those conversations with yourself in a way that feels centered and grounded.
Okay. And are you able to give us a practical example or maybe walk us through an exercise that somebody could do in terms of like, how does this actually play out? Do I meditate and then I ask the question, do I want kids or not? Or what would you suggest?
I mean, so great question. So the first thing I can offer you is a tool, and then we can talk about how to use it. So the people have probably done breathing before, but you can check in with yourself. And if you're listening, check where your breath is landing right now. If it's landing in your chest or in your belly when you're breathing. And then what you'll find is that for a lot of people, we shallow breathe. And so when people started studying breath in the 30s and 40s, we were breathing about 6 to 10 breaths a minute. Now we're breathing about 15 to 20 breaths a minute. So it's almost like we're panting, right? So we're panting, which is activating the stress response.
Wow.
So the first thing we need to do is slow down our breath because that deactivates the stress response. So you can do what's called the 4-6 breath, which is counting in for 4. And then a pause and an exhale for 6. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and pause, exhale, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And as you keep breathing, I'm going to keep talking. And so on each of the exhales, just letting your body get a little bit heavier. And on the inhale, seeing if you can bring that breath all the way into your belly. And as you breathe, what you'll see is that your nervous system starts coming back into that parasympathetic state. It's like if you can breathe out that long, then we must be safe. So the key is to exhale a little bit longer than the inhale. And so as you've been breathing, Keltie, what do you notice is changing for you as you breathe?
I definitely feel calmer and much more centered. I mean, I remain quite present during these podcast episodes because my mind can't manage or afford to go anywhere else. But yeah, I just noticed talking to you, there was quite a bit of excitement, which is a good thing. But excitement is also this sort of fight or flight response.
Yes.
And so just feeling things come down a notch and having, more groundedness and centeredness, if that's a word.
Totally.
It is,
and then
right?
I would even say that it is. Yeah, absolutely. 100. I love it. And then I would say the second thing is give yourself some space to not have to ask the question. So actually start cultivating this sort of more grounded, centered space for yourself and just allow yourself to be for a little bit, not always have that question on your mind. And then you can start, maybe you can start journaling, like, how do I feel about, what are my worries? And if we do it from this place of centeredness and groundedness, you'll notice the way that you write. You'll notice that your handwriting probably looks different than when you're writing it from this space of, oh my gosh, I need to make this choice. Let me make it really fast. My time is running out, right? So if you can write about it, think about it, journal about it from this space, you'll just notice that it will feel different.
Yeah. Okay. Super interesting and helpful. And for those of you, I know a lot of us, going through this decision, we do journal or we maybe do reflection questions. And I know this is a practice I've brought into our group coaching programs. We always take a few minutes at the beginning just to kind of connect with like our bodily sensations, how we're feeling to arrive in that moment, because the decision itself can make us feel really keyed up. And of course, there's this time
Yes.
pressure and, the clock is ticking and all that.
Yeah.
But when we furthermore bring our whole day and everything we've been doing up to the point where we sit down to kind of
Yes.
explore things, it's like everything is just magnified or multiplied.
Yeah. And maybe you aren't going to find the answer thinking about it. Maybe you will
Yeah.
be walking in a forest and you take a few deep breaths and you just check in, like, how does my body feel when I think about having a child? Or how does my body feel thinking about not having one? And then going, okay, well, like, what's behind that sensation? Or
Yeah.
even just allowing the sensation to appear. And you can say, like, if you had a voice, what would you want to tell me right now?
Yeah. Super interesting. Yeah. I like that, actually giving voice to that emotion or that part of yourself that probably wants to be heard.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested what your thoughts are on feelings of anxiety or fear, because I think a lot of people, when they think about this decision, and I think I want to say specifically when they think about motherhood, but of course it can certainly be the case for being child free as well. But the unknown tends to hold, I think, a lot more
Yes.
fear. What are your thoughts on if I say, well, in my body, I feel fear, I feel tension, I feel my heart racing? I think there's this piece of, is that just me being afraid, or does that mean this isn't for me? And so how do you think we can develop discernment in terms of like whether it's our underlying desire talking or whether it's
Mm-hmm.
fear? And if it is, I mean, I also am curious what your thoughts are is if we do feel fear and anxiety around a decision, is that necessarily a bad thing, or can that also be a guide for us?
I think the first thing to recognize is that the fear and the anxiety isn't about the decision, it's the discomfort in between,
So true.
right? So you'll notice that once you make a decision, that discomfort changes dramatically. So it's really about the pressure that you're putting on yourself to make the right decision, all the choices that you have. It's really not about the choice itself. It's the anticipation of the choice. So if we can remember that part about the fear and the anxiety, that it's actually about the discomfort of the decision-making process, not so much the decision itself, it, I think, takes a load off of our minds, off of our shoulders in making a choice. Because we come back to, this isn't about the choice. This is about the unknown. And once I make the choice, I know I can be okay.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of insight there because it is this like stuck in between place that really feels so terrible. And, the
Mm-hmm.
irony is I think we stay in that middle ground because we're afraid of the discomfort that might reside on either side once we've made a decision, because as we've talked about, there will be challenges that will arise. What would you say to someone who says, and I sometimes hear this from people, I thought I decided. So I made the decision to have kids. Now they
Mm-hmm.
perhaps are not pregnant and not expecting a child yet, but we've decided we're going to do this, my partner and I, or conversely, I've decided I'm going to stay child free. And then days or weeks go by and it kind of like starts up again. It's like, oh no, I feel anxious. Is that the right thing? And so I
Yeah.
guess just to counter, okay, they've made a choice. Let's say the anxiety doesn't seem to have gone away or it only disappears briefly. What would you say to that?
So I think the first thing I would love to recognize is what a privilege it is that you can make the choice at all.
Thank you. Yeah.
Right. So I remember when we were having our second, it took a long time, not because we were trying, but because we weren't sure. And a friend of mine came and she said, oh, I guess you've been trying for that long too, because she couldn't have a baby and she was trying for a very long time. So I think there's a recognition that there is a privilege in having this choice at all.
Yes.
Which is not to say that it's not hard, but it's to say that, can we shift our perspective a little bit? And in shifting that perspective to a place of some sort of gratitude, it actually takes some of the anxiety and fear away.
Yeah. That's so true. And, I think I have somebody who's on this season. We may or may not have heard from her when this conversation airs, but, and I plan to speak to other guests who had really wanted to have a child or children and were unable to. And I think that there's something that we can learn from people who've really, found happiness and joy in their life, despite their best laid
Mm-hmm.
plans not coming to fruition, because it's a good reminder for us, first of all, that we, as people who can't decide, it's like, it is a challenge, it is a problem, but it's a privileged problem to have to be able to make this decision at all. And a reminder that sometimes in life, we find ourselves in circumstances that we didn't choose, and yet we can still find fulfillment in that. And so I think it's a good reminder to just also kind of check ourselves and say, okay, it's okay that I'm wrapped up in this and that I'm overwhelmed, but it's a decision, not even just as far as being able to get pregnant or not, but like, if you're able to access reproductive health care, like that, it's a privilege to be able to make this decision or decide not to continue with a pregnancy. If you have that decision at your disposal, you are very fortunate, and it's not a given for all people and women on this planet. Certainly not.
Yeah.
Okay, Natasha, before we wrap things up, I'm curious to hear, what would you say has been the best part about being a mom? What do you love most?
As babies, I really just wanted to squish them. It was like, but also I think actually that was kind of, and my love for them has changed from like squishy, oh my gosh, you're so cute, to like, I'm just so proud of the human that you are. And I think so that's been really amazing to watch this transformation of someone in front of me like that. But I think that taps into something else, which is this pure wonderment that we can create something like that. Like, people talk about high tech this, high tech that. Like, we are super high tech. We are incredible and magical. And so that has been amazing to think about and experience and see these changes and this growth and the evolution just from like the biology of it all. I think that's been really, that's been holding a lot of my wonderment at this whole process.
Yeah. It is incredible. And I can only imagine, now having daughters that are 13 and 18, like how incredible it must be to see the people that they are becoming and evolving into. And you talk about the squish phase, we'll call it. What's it like having teenagers? Like, has it been, I know a lot of people say like, oh, it's terrible and it's hard and it's drama. What's it been like for you?
There have been challenging moments, and then there have been amazing moments. And I think that's what we have to, again, right? What side of the story do you want to tell? So I'm not saying I'm not going to tell the stories that have been challenging, but it's also been something else too. So it's that reminder that it's a sea of different experiences. It's not just one or the other.
Yeah. Okay, so before we wrap things up, I have 5 rapid fire questions that I will ask. The first 2 are just finish the sentence. So being a mom is?
Interesting.
Being a mom is not?
Being a mom, I'm sorry, I'm taking too long.
Okay. No, it's all good.
I don't know. Being a mom is not everything.
What is one resource or tool that you'd like to recommend or share with those who are on the fence about kids?
Doing some personal development and awareness work.
And what is one thing that you would like child-free people to know?
Whatever choice you make, you're going to have a good life.
Okay, and if you could give one piece of advice to someone who's currently on the fence about whether or not to have kids, what would that piece of advice be?
Come talk to me or Keltie.
Amen. I love when people answer that way.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure you'll be hearing from some listeners. Please reach out to Natasha, let her know what you thought about this episode. If you have further questions for her, if you're interested in working with her. Natasha, where can we find you, and what are all the things we need to know about what you're up to?
You can find me on my website, digdeepcounseling.com, or on my Instagram handle, also Dig Deep Counseling. And, you can book a consultation with me to see if we're a good fit, and you can do that directly through the website. And I would love to hear from you.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being on, Natasha, and wishing everyone listening a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Okay, now that we've wrapped up today's conversation, this is the part of the episode where I tell you that you need to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. And you really need to do that. And I'm going to tell you why. And that is because one of the big ways that people find and discover new podcasts like this one is through reviews. So if you yourself can go say what you loved about this podcast, why people who are on the fence should tune into the Kids Are Child-Free podcast, that's going to help other people who are also wondering, should I have kids or stay child-free, to discover us. Thank you in advance for doing so. I will be featuring some of the reviews in upcoming episodes, so maybe I'll share yours. You never know. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you back here soon for our next episode.